I'm in Goshen, Indiana at this moment in the United States. But to get here and to get to this day, it's kind of an odyssey that I can call back or go back to kind of an odyssey to get here. Everett has invited me to share a little bit about personal experience on migration, and then we can talk a little bit more about trauma as well and the work that we're doing with trauma. My story starts in Guatemala in 1970. I just turned 50 years old, 51 years old last week. And I was born in the midst of a civil war or an internal conflict in Guatemala in 1970s, a civil war from 1960 until 1996. And then I remember the first few years of my life being kind of normal between that time. But then 1978, my father is protesting one of those protests similar to what you're seeing in Colombia today. And then he was kidnapped by the Guatemalan government, and he disappeared for about a week. And during that time, he was tortured. I remember going to the hospital and seeing my dad with eyes bloodshot, broken bones in his face, and I was 8, 9 years old at that time, and that threw us into this turmoil. From that moment on, my father was traumatized by the experience, and trying to figure out. He was going to university at that point. He was also he was a veterinarian. He was studying to be a veterinarian, and he had a clinic, a veterinary clinic, and he had to close it. Then by 1980, May of 1980, my father had to cross the border into Mexico as a political refugee. And then 3 months later, then the rest of the family, 5 children and my mother, then we crossed the border into Mexico, and then we joined my dad as a political refugee. And then we lived there for a few months. Then my father applies for refugee status in Canada, and then he receives it, but the rest of the family is returned to Guatemala. In that part of the story, I don't know very well, but I think my father decided to apply for himself, and he didn't mention the rest of the family. So then we get separated. We get sent back to Guatemala. My father in 1981, in January of 1981, he goes to Canada, and then we were separated for that period of time. During that time, I go back to school, but I was starting also to having issues. I was in 4th grade when we left Guatemala. I was in 4th grade when we arrived in Mexico. Then we returned the next year. The family in Guatemala got separated too. My mother could not have the 5 children together. So then we're separated at that point. I'm living with my uncle who had another 7 children. So then nobody really cared too much about my education. So that year I spent in 4th grade again. And the next year, when I returned to Guatemala City to reunite with my mother, then I'm back to 4th grade, and I finished my elementary a little bit late, 2 years later. So that's one, the effect of that in my education, but also the separations, many goodbyes, right, during that time. In 1986, then we hear that the documents to reunite with my father were coming through, and that we had been accepted by the government of Canada to reunite with my father. So then in February 1986, then we take off and we go to Canada. And nothing could prepare us to what was coming for us. We were living in Guatemala, 25 degrees Celsius in February, and then we arrived in February in Canada and minus 25 degrees Celsius. And that's the first encounter what I think and what I have experienced as a new birth. I was 15 years old and felt like being born again. When you arrive, you come out of the motherland, and you come out, and you have to change the way you dress. I remember being they were putting on these snowsuits and hats and gloves to walk out into the cold of Canada at minus 25 degrees Celsius. And my mother trying to grind the corn for the tortillas by hand, because she could not find flour for the tortillas, all sort of things, adjustments to our diets, the language. People started speaking English to us, and at that point, I only could say pencil, chicken, you're welcome, thank you. That was about it. And so the language is another thing. And soon enough, then, at the beginning, the snow looks beautiful, everything looks beautiful. You have this honeymoon with the country. And then after that, after about 3 months, then we all start crying like babies out of place. And we just want to go back home. So we were driving my father crazy. Also, after 5 years of reuniting, we had changed, right? The last time I saw my father was when I was 10 years old. We reunited when I'm turning 16. My mother and my dad could not get back together. They tried, but they were having issues as well. So then family just breaks down. And my mother goes back to Guatemala with my sister. And then the three boys, my two brothers and I stay with my dad. So our family breaks again. And one of the things that I experienced during that time was that when we arrived in Canada, a lot of people put a lot of emphasis on you have to learn the language. English was important for us. So then right away, he said, English, we had English lessons, we had school, we had a roof, we had food, we have everything else, but nobody walked with us through the process of what was going to happen emotionally and to us, and this the psychosocial part of this work. And so we didn't have any accompaniment in that area, which I think it would have been very helpful for us to have somebody walking through those pains and sorrows, the losses. And a doctor, Joseba Chotegi in the University of Barcelona has coded this as the Ulysses syndrome. These losses and these mornings of migration where you lose family and loved ones at the home place, and then after that, the change of native language, the culture, the customs, religion, values, the landscapes, the smells and the taste of your lands. All these things are being left behind, right? The social status for some people, your ethnic group, and then the physical safety risks of migration, moving from one place to the other. And I think those are some of the things that are traumatizing sometimes. When we arrive in a new place, sometimes those are not addressed. And right away, then you start behaving different, and you start, so then English is important. And after 4 years, I was speaking English, but our family was broken. And I wish that somebody could have at least known or be informed about trauma awareness and how to walk with us through all this painful part of our migration. One of the things that helped me to that was we started attending a church, and this church was our network. It became our network. These were asylum seekers, refugees, and immigrants from Peru, from the Pinochet Allende, coup in Chile. These were people who were fleeing from the war in Nicaragua and El Salvador, people who had migrated in the previous decade, and now they had all the connections. So they knew where the doctor who spoke Spanish was, and where they sold the flour for the tortillas and the black beans and all the stuff that could not find in the market. They became translators, interpreters, and they also were the people who walked with us and embraced us in some way during this pain. Also, this became my network in rebuilding some pieces of my life. When I was 13, I just didn't care about school anymore. When we arrived in Canada, and then I also went to high school for a year and a half, but then I dropped out. I got married a couple of months before I turned 18. And then I started working as a janitor. I was a forklift operator. I was a truck driver, a painter. I was a cook. And then after that, the Mennonite Central Committee, the organization that I work with right now, was offering training for skill training for auto mechanics. So then I took that training. And before this life here in Indiana, I was a auto mechanic for Toyota and Lexus and specialized in those vehicles. So I worked for about 10 years in that area. And then during that time in the church, in leadership in the church, then somebody said to me, you should go to university. And I said, no, you're crazy. You know, I don't have high school. But then they insisted that I should do that and that I should write my GED, or the general education diploma, to get my high school diploma. So then I did. I sent the transcripts to a university, a Mennonite university here in Goshen, and I was accepted. So then I came to study here with my family, my daughter, my wife, and 3 daughters. And they gave me that opportunity to study here. I graduated with history and theology degrees. And then after that, I was given opportunity to go get a master's degree. And so then I went to school for 3 more years, and then I got a master's degree. Before ending that master's degree, then somebody with Mennonite Central Committee tapped me on the shoulder and they said, you should apply for this position of immigration education coordinator. And then here I am 13 years later telling you this story, which sometimes like I said, an odyssey that sometimes I don't believe myself, because when I go back 40 years ago, I was one of these children crossing the border today with their mother in very unknown situations. And it was, the help of some people also guiding there. But also I have to say that my family has been hit by this movement in several different ways. And I also carry some of those wounds with me. My mother developed depression, and for about 3 decades she lived with that depression that also I believe killed her. She passed away 3 years ago at the age of 71, and she died with many illnesses in her body, but mainly depression. And I think that's one of the losses that I have felt. My mother just could not handle the losses of the separation of the family, and that was one of the things that she kept coming back in. And also in the Latina culture, mental health issues are really not, we don't treat them well. We don't talk about it much. So then auto medication was her way of dealing with a lot of this stuff. My two brothers live in Calgary in Canada. My 2 sisters live in Guatemala at this point. I believe that in the last 30 years or 35 years, I've spent probably maybe 4 months the maximum with them, right? In all that time. So I don't know them very well, and that separation of family, we are connected with Facebook and WhatsApp these days, but still this connection is there. So today, when I find a lot of people who are in the migration process, and I can see that, and foresee some of the situations that they're coming in their way. So how can we walk along with people that are encountering those situations, and also who will be dealing with the issue of trauma and those wounds that are caused because of their migration? So that brings us then to the work that we're doing right now with the AITM group, and how that experience has informed my position on this, and how should we walk with people at this point that we are offering. I work with offering legal training to nonprofits, and so we offer legal training, we offer advocacy, some education about know your rights to immigrant groups, with educating the public in some ways, but and also the part of the psychosocial accompaniment and work with these communities as they arrive in their integration. It seems to me that here in the United States, we are inviting people to assimilate and not to integrate. So we want to assimilate very quick to the culture here. You have to become American, you have to speak English really quick, but then it's not to integrate into society in a very healthy way. So how do we find also those tools? So I'm interested in that work. I also been researching quite a bit. I found a study that says that migrant youth who have gone through all these adversities, they're resilient. So there is trauma, also the resilience, right? The ability that we have to bounce back after adversity. So then this migrant children have this window of resilience that is this high. So then that resilience, how can we use it? We know that migrants, when they arrive in a new country, they want to thrive and they're risk takers. And then how can we use those things, the goodness that also comes with that resilience and that risk taking? A lot of migrants right away when they come, they want to start businesses. Why is it that citizens take a long time to put up a business when migrants can just right away just build something really quick and then start selling tortillas, pupusas, or tacos or anything else, and they're not really thinking too much about the risk of losing again because they know how to handle that adversity as well. So anyway, I come then to this with that experience, that background in the wounds also of migration, interested as I have reflected on my own experience of migration and how do we accompany people in the issues of migration. And I am probably going to leave it there, and because I've said a lot in a few minutes, and of course the story is way broader than that. I could take I'm sure that people have a lot of questions on some of this stuff, but I just want to leave it there and then open it up for questions, for if you need to know a little bit more about anything of this or details, please let me know.
Okay. Saulo, thank you very much. And the floor is open for comments or questions. And the fundamental issue is the question of long-term trauma, short-term, but also long-term, which Saulo has reflected. And the question that Saulo poses about what does it take? What should we be thinking of as accompaniment, as in supporting people in that process? Niels.
Thanks. Thank you, Saulo, for sharing. I get an impression that you could guide us a little bit on the integration process. We have a big problem in Sweden because the state thinks that they have to be responsible for the reception of refugees and their integration. But the state can never employ a friend. Mm-hmm. And very clearly in your process in Canada, your contact with the church and the linkages that provided, as well as the Latinos that were there and their involvement in guiding, certainly helped you along the way and brought you to where you are today. And I think in Sweden, to be able to uphold high levels of reception of refugees, which is not the case at the moment, we need to find something that mixes what the state does as basic issues for reception of refugees and what we in civil society do to help the integration process and to make people feel at home, feel welcome, get that encouragement, go to university or finish your high school or whatever. So your reflections around what are some key elements in helping an integration process, I would be very happy to hear.
Right. Thank you, Niels, for that question. Yes.
So let me just take a couple more and then we'll come back to you.
Excellent. Yes.
A few more questions and comments.
Krishna here.
Okay, and then Krishna. Martin and then Krishna.
Oh, okay. Thanks. No, I absolutely agree with Niels. I mean, I think this is an extraordinarily important area of work, which is often terribly overlooked in societies which receive refugees and migrants. And just a couple of thoughts and comments, and I'd be very interested in what you think about this. In the 80s, we were able in the UK to establish really quite an innovative and comprehensive program of support for community associations. And as part of their funding for part-time workers, their job was to assist newly arriving members of the different communities. So there was a Vietnamese community group, a Cambodian group, what else do we have? A Chilean group and an Iranian group, and so on. And this funding support was quickly became a victim of some, new financial regulation, and it seemed to me extraordinarily short-sighted that the value of putting resources into the hands of communities to support the integration of people arriving from their own societies is not sufficiently recognized. And the second thing, really right at the opposite end of the spectrum, I think we should not be afraid to point out that, there have been in this country in the last few years a number of incidents where people have lost their lives, and where quite clearly the reason for that has been a failure of adaptation and integration by a refugee or migrant, precisely for the reasons that you describe in your very, very interesting presentation. And for some reason, people don't seem willing to stand up and say, look, if we don't get this process right, people in our own societies are going to get killed. Because of course it's rare, but it's not really all that rare. I mean, we had an incident on the London Underground, a number of people seriously injured, which was caused by a refugee who had simply not been properly supported in his integration into the country. So I think we shouldn't be too afraid to point out the risks of not doing it properly.
Thank you very much, Martin. Krishna.
Saulo, thank you very much. That's a very interesting and somewhat exciting story. There is a saying that, the end of something, if it is good, then everything is good. You forget about the past. So I hope that you are happy about, despite the pain and the difficulty you suffered today, where you and your family are, it's a victory. So I congratulate you on that. Your story resonates to me in terms of what happened to the Bhutanese refugees who were in Nepal through UNHCR support and UN support for 10, 15 years. And then about 12 years ago, US granted asylum to 50,000 people from there. I think it was either families or people, and who moved gradually over a couple of years to different parts of the US in a very organized way of asylum, as refugees. And they were settled into 2-3 communities. And I know some of the people there, and we have spoken with them. They underwent a lot of different kinds of problems. Some of that relates to your story as well. Depression was very common, especially among the elderly people who felt out of society completely, no sense of belongingness, language difficulty, socially no recognition, nothing. Although everything else materially was taken care of compared to what they had back home and in Nepal. So that, and then there were several cases of suicide as well that came to that came to news. To me, the way they got support was later out of their own community, when people like you and others took leadership and responsibility and got linked up with some NGOs, you know, informal setup, and also seeking government support. And he started providing support to them because there were no other institutions that would help in a bigger scale. We have seen similar situation in Nepali communities where people came with asylum in smaller numbers, where there have been some NGOs from the Nepali community themselves and people helping each other. So one thing is that kind of model you have seen where it is happening, or the potential for that, like, you know, seeking government support, you know, charity funds, and you know, providing that kind of support through people from their own community who understand the problem, who know the language, who are much more you know, committed than perhaps, you know, others who are not part of that community, is one. Two is, how about mobilizing the media, the local media, the state media, maybe not the national media, and going to them and saying, look what is happening. I mean, you bring in people here in a country to protect their human rights and give them better lives. But human rights is not only food and job. How about mental health? How about, you know, psychosocial support and emotional well-being too? So those two fronts might be the way to go.
Thank you very much, Krishna. Another comment or so before I turn it back. So, Pilar, you're muted.
Thank you very much. Saulo, empathize with your personal story, and thank you for sharing it with us, because this resonates in me terribly. So I do agree with you that the psychosocial support is absolutely essential, and especially for communities that have been traumatized, for children that are uprooted completely. And as we speak, we have, I belong to the Chilean diaspora as well, or used to. And this is something that, a point that I think it's been developed and it has evolved somehow. When, I mean, let's say 40, 45 years ago, there was no UNHCR at your side, or IOM, or any other institution, actually. You had to make your own decisions. You were totally unaccompanied. And I really understand that point, because that is what we have been working for many, many years. So this is something that your legal, you're talking about legal training for non-profit or legal advice, that I think it has to be coupled with psychosocial, and it's a number of things that you need to provide. However, I think it's important to look at whatever it says is the long-term trauma, because it continues. What you mentioned about your mother, it lasted for 30 years. And that happens also to, let's say, to teachers that they have been, and to children, and although they build resilience, yes, but also they are broken somehow. And this broken wounds of migration, I like very much that. I think they continue with us. You are really working with that, and that goes to depression and etc. Now, to me, what is important is how do you deal with that at the classroom level, for instance, or in education, and how do you transfer all of that? How can you actually help or support, because you are supporting children and teachers as well that both are traumatized in their own way. That is something that I think we can obviously discuss, but this is tremendously critical.
Thank you very much, Pilar. And that's a great way to shift over for Pilar, and then we'll have another round of comments. And to reiterate that what Pilar has said is a good jumping off point, that the question is, okay, what is it that we can do more, should be done more and better? Saulo, back to you for the comment.
Yes, thank you so much for your comments and your questions. But going back to maybe just I'll go on the same line here. Niels was asking, about the receiving communities in some ways. I think the education for the receiving community is critical in this. We haven't done a good job in educating the receiving communities. The terminology is not helping right now. Terminology we're using for migration right now is not very helpful, right? Here in the United States, we use aliens or illegal aliens. What happened to the terminology we used to use of pioneers and explorers, right? Or even newcomers. How about if we were to talk about these people as, look at these new pioneers crossing the border, right? The language has changed so much. Terminology is not very helpful to see what we're doing, but the education for receiving communities is critical, I think, in receiving people. And how do we also perceive people who are coming at this point? So for me, that will be one of the things of education for the receiving community. We have failed terribly here in the United States in educating the receiving community about people who are crossing the border right now, or immigrants coming in any way, or refugees as well. So we can open the doors, we can open the quotas for migration and refugees, but if we don't do anything about educating the receiving community about that, then which is critical, I think it's we're failing. Let me see. With the issues of integration, I think as well. If we don't, many of the children who are coming right now, and unaccompanied minors, I find here in the schools, are joining other communities, gangs, and they're finding their resilience is being used for, guided a different way. And how can we also bring that or use that resilience, that risk taking, or those things that they are using, those strengths they have gained through these experiences, in the resilience towards things that are more useful and a healthy way of living. So so that's, I'm interested also in that piece. Let me see. In Krishna brought this when I think about the communities that have helped me and have walked along with me, it's true. When I was talking about the Chilean community that had arrived a decade before in Canada, and they knew already, they had resources. In so many ways, the governments, we can trust the governments to create some processes, but it seems like immigrant communities, out of their experience, have had to come up with advocating for themselves in their own needs. And in many ways, then how do we plug into the work that is happening in the communities for the needs that they're having? We can provide them, entering into the country, and maybe here in the United States, refugees receive support for about 9 months, and then after that we leave them loose. How can we walk with them, even in some other issues as well, and plug into the work of their needs? The needs are coming up from those communities. So yes, it's critical for us to connect to the communities and continue to work with them in their needs as well. The other piece of this in the long term is that trauma can be passed from generation to generation. So the trauma that my mother experienced, it's also passed on to me in so many ways, and to my brothers and sisters. My sisters live with depression as well. My brothers and I, we have experienced addictions of some sorts, or different situations out of that as well. So then working with children right now in the classroom is going to Pilar's question as well. How do we deal with at the classroom level this is one of the reasons why we were talking to parent-teacher liaisons with Elaine yesterday and trying to address at that level, educating here in Goshen, Indiana, where 52% of our children in the school system are Latina children and sons and daughters of immigrants. How can we educate and inform the administration of the school, the teachers, and those working with them who encounter a lot of children who don't want to go to school, who are not good in school, and for them, they say, well, you know, there's the Latina community that they don't like to go to school. That's how they are taking it, right? They're not taking it from a trauma-informed perspective of like, these kids have been beaten by all these wounds of migration, right? And their families as well. What is it like to live with a parent who is afraid and has lived here with deportation orders and with the fear of deportation every day? So things like that. So then for us is educating the communities, the administration in the school, the teachers, but also working with the parents and the kids in addressing this and giving information, giving them tools, so also that they can co-regulate their brains so that they can be thinking and creative and social a little bit more. Anyway, those are some of the ways that I think we can respond to this.
Let me take it right from there and to say we'll go another round of questions here. And if I could focus it on what it is in the AITM program with Elaine and Vernon and others supporting this, and in your other work in psychosocial, what is it that you believe that this program has uniquely to offer? Why AITM as a solution or as a contributor to the solution to this? What's the principles that people should know that you're arguing for?
Right. And I'm also inviting Vernon and Elaine into this conversation as well, because they've been working with me in this. So if you both want to jump into this, please do that. But yeah, I think, or maybe I should just open up for Elaine and Vernon if you want to jump into this here as part of the team.
Did you want more questions, Everett, first, or do you want to?
No, your comment. Go ahead. Let's talk about this one, and then we'll open it up.
Well, you know, part of what we have to offer is that whole piece that I think, Saulo, you've stated very clearly that's missing in so much of the assistance that is given to refugees and immigrants, and that is the whole mental health, or just some basic sort of I don't even want to say psychosocial, but I'll just say that psychosocial, some basic information and a space to even think about and talk about and name what they've been through. And so I think, I would say, number one, that's probably the biggest thing, whether we're talking about actually working directly with the people in the migration experience that are directly impacted, or whether you're working with the service providers or the people who are helping people at different stages of the journey, whether it's from leaving home on the journey or resettlement or that longer term integration. And so I just in the few pilots we have done in the last couple of months, it just keeps coming through that what they really appreciate is that a safe space to even talk about and think about and share with others what their experience has been, whether no matter whether they're service providers or migrants. And the other thing is language just keeps coming out. It's just like they're so grateful to have some sort of language that helps them identify and express what they've been feeling and thinking and what's been going on in their minds, but they haven't had the language or concepts or framework to even talk about it. And so it just again this morning, I was talking with a friend in Georgia a community that's working with especially women who have been trafficked or abused, and it was just like it again became very clear that I was wishing we could offer something there again to them, because I think just having a space to talk about it, identify, and some sort of language, I would just name two of the biggest things. I also just say, though, I think just having very there's a part of it is that it puts it on a very what's offered in the AITM is theory, but very practical tools for anybody. So it's not like it's something that all of us can use, basically, whether we've been in the migration experience, or whether we're working with others, or whether we're just human beings. And so I think it's just very practical information and tools to move through difficult wounds and experiences.
Vernon, do you have anything you would add?
I'll leave it to Elaine and Saulo to add more details. I simply want to make one statement related to the things that Elaine has been mentioning, and Saulo earlier as well, and some of you commented in your questions and comments about this, and that is, while this is very focused in helping individuals figure out what's happening to them, it's also very integrated into looking at what the collective can bring to this as a source of actually working through this. And I've heard this mentioned, so this is not new to anybody, but that's one of the things that's taken very seriously is how this impacts the collective, and so that the whole idea of collective trauma is, people have been having webinars and so forth around that for some time, but this, while it's very practical and useful individually or with families, it's also very helpful in understanding where collective action can be involved. So just to add that into the mix.
Saudamini and Krishna, you're working on the same issue, perhaps with slightly different tools. What's your feedback to Saulo and on these issues? What's your learning?
I mean, Krishna, I'd love it if you come in. I'll just quickly say, first of all, thank you, Saulo, because you related a story journey. Your odyssey is just very personal, and it does actually have a lot of linkage with the work we're doing on a couple points. I'll just mention, and perhaps you could comment. I mean, one is that, as you know, our work started in COVID response, but COVID is, I don't like the expression tip of the iceberg, but it's really the entry point for an entire spectrum of very urgent needs where psychosocial support has been lacking. And this is a very multi-racial, multi-ethnic immigrant community primarily that we're working with, but intergenerational. So there's all that in the mix. Also, just 2 points I wanted to make, which we've encountered, and I think it's very, it was very telling in your own journey, which is the gender. And Pilar also mentioned that. I mean, what you explained, I think, really gives a clear indication of how different the risks, vulnerabilities, and capacities are for both men and women and girls and boys, and just how that affected you in your personal story. You touched on it, and I think it's something that is prevalent. I mean, it's not unusual, but it's prevalent. And the other thing is social justice, because that's become a huge component of the work we're doing on psychosocial support. And I just wonder about your father, and what he experienced, and how it affected him and the family and you all, and the lack of justice, and how that impacts the mental health of the family and the community. So those are just some initial thoughts. Thank you.
Just to add to that,
Sorry.
I would say
One more thing. I forgot, I wanted to say about the safe spaces. That's become a very, very important priority in the work that we're doing, establishing them and making that part of the response. And Elaine, you mentioned that. Thank you. Sorry.
Thank you. Krishna?
Yeah, there's two things I would like to add. One is in terms of the actual framework of working with communities, individuals, people, families. When we look at needs, their issues, problems, the whole area of psychological, emotional health, mental health, we know that it has been ignored widely in most of the countries in the world, and US is not an exception. That's very clear to us. Perhaps it's a burning example of what that is being done, because in a materialistic capitalism-driven worlds, I think it's the hardware that people look at first. Even housing and clothing, and of course food and other needs take much more dominance than looking at mental health issues that, in terms of human rights and the real internal human needs, might carry much more weight, but oftentimes in societies they are not treated that well. We are aware. If you look at the UN's role, UNICEF, the exposure during COVID, where mental health is, we talk about it virtually every week, because now it's coming at a big area, but it's still, we are tinkering with it, just tip of the iceberg. So I think I would like to emphasize the point that when we look at the needs of the communities, their problem assessment, whatever you call it, whichever way we collect the data, we should emphasize more that mental health, emotional health is put up front, not at the end of the one line or something, or nowhere. And it's a cross-cutting issue that not only one or two agencies will look at, but it's something that relates to everything else. I mean, brain and mind relates to all parts of the body, let me put it that way. The physical, mental health is the holistic definition of health. So I think that I cannot overemphasize that. We need to look at that. And then the second one is in our example, and also I gave several examples from the past, I think working with the community-based organizations is the way to go. The system will care for smart people who can go for referral and treatment and so on, but the system does not cater for those who are not capable of doing that and who are not at that stage. It's more curative. So I think for preventive, as Sodhamini said, listening groups, communication strategies, forming groups where people can communicate their issues and do something about it themselves, helping each other. These softwares, which require much more work than providing hardware, might be real solutions. And there, obviously, community leaders, even religious, faith-based institutions, youth groups, women groups, community groups of different kinds who are there, who understand, who live with the communities. I think if we support them, that might bring much more success than thinking about and waiting for the system to take the responsibility. All the best, everyone.
Thanks ever so much, Krishna. That's great. What I propose we do, because this is obvious. Oh, Jim, you have a comment, and then what we're going to do is go around and end with Saulo. Jim, go ahead.
So you raise a number of issues, and I had 3 or 4 points I wanted to make, but let me pick up on the last comments. What my conclusion is that the work, when we're doing work like this, if we can share what we're doing with the public around us, I think that is not just an important thing to find some financial support for some things we need to do, but critically, it's to actually build bridges between them and us. And what we're in this incredibly siloed world, and everybody on that side of the equation is the enemy, and we're all the good people. So this point that was just made about, churches and synagogues and other places to do this. And so the people that are the most absolute supporters, from financial resources to policy making, to standing in the square with the people, are the people who have some way or another come into real relationships with these groups. So all over the country, you have people who are involved one way or the other in mental health, sometimes because of their own conditions. And so connecting to some of those white bread kinds of organizations and doing some cross-fertilization at the level of your work, I think could be really, really powerful for all kinds of long-term kinds of solutions, because there are shared issues but at the outset, people just don't see what those shared issues are. And I think, so that's kind of a recommendation and question. One thing I wanted to ask you, and it's a purely personal thing because of another client I have, and that is, in terms of you getting a formal education at the time that you got it and having something that was actually a degree, I'd love to know from you. Send me an email about this. You don't have to answer it from everybody, but I'd love to know how you would place that in some sort of hierarchy in terms of value. So is that the fact that someone reached out to you and you were able to do that, and then how did that fit in? And is this something that a pathway to that kind of thing? I'm not talking about for 100% of the people so much, but I'm talking about of the people like you who are leaders, because I have this thing about how do we get the training and education and assistance to the leaders in the communities that are doing this kind of work. It just seems to me that that's a vacuum, and if we don't address it, we're never going to have enough of you in the field doing the work that needs to be done. Finally, I just would mention a client I had several years ago called Mothers to Mothers, and it started in South Africa, but it was a psychosocial training. So a doctor from California goes to South Africa and realizes that he probably can't change the policy of that crazy health minister who denied AIDS was, coming from HIV, but the fact that people could go to those big massive clinics and sit out under those tin sheds all day and get a test. But the problem was there was nobody to talk to that woman after she got a test and found out that she had HIV and was told how she could keep from transmitting that to her child. So it was only other mothers who had HIV that could do that counseling with those mothers, because the woman who was pregnant usually went home to her mother-in-law, and she probably got the disease from her from her husband, who was a truck driver and got the disease somewhere along the road. So the idea was that you had a whole thing, and that one set of interventions was PEPFAR, says that's one of the best investments that they ever made was in that program, because it permeated so far, so fast, and so densely that it really allowed the turnaround in the prevention of transmission from mother to child. And so I just think this piece of psychosocial work that you're doing is so important. And I think there are all kinds of proofs of that around the world. And I think maybe there's some examples that might be supportive of each other in that. Sorry to take so much time.
That's great. That's great. Great points. Let's, because of the time constraint, let's do our last round of comments, and then we're going to end with Saulo, and you can give any final comments. Orla, from your point of view, final comment.
Yeah, thank you so much for a very interesting speech, but also the comments from my good colleagues, most interesting. Saulo, you mentioned that the terminology has changed, and that's terribly true. Unfortunately, that's not the only thing which has changed, because had it just been a linguistic issue, then I think we could have solved it. No, the attitude in the recipient countries have changed over decades. Some 40 years back, newcomers, immigrants, refugees were most welcome, also in Europe. These days, the same group of people are not welcome anymore in our countries. It's a disgrace, and I'm shameful mentioning it, but you know it. And it's terrible, and it makes it even more difficult to try to integrate the few who do manage to get into our luxury society, our silos, because we do live in silos these days. The situation might be different on the other side of the Atlantic Ocean. I'm not quite sure. But in Europe these days, where we used to have a tradition for receiving refugees, like in Niels's country, Sweden, my own country, Denmark, and so forth, these days, it's a sad story. I worked for the Danish Refugee Council years back, and we had individual casework, and we had a very little community work. And I think my lesson learned from that time was actually that I did spend a few weeks down in my home county trying to tell people, and I'm a country boy, trying to tell my good friends down there, why do we receive refugees and how can we actually help them and help ourselves? So, and I have followed up on this 25 years later, and quite a few of those I managed to get to my home county. They are still there and they are doing fine. Whereas a lot of other people where the state was trying to integrate them just as the individual was a number, then you find the trauma, you find the families being split and so forth. So I think we have a hell of a job to do to educate, even in well-educated countries like Sweden, Denmark, France, and so forth, the communities, to understand why we have this obligation and we need them. US is made by immigrants, and you wouldn't survive without immigrants in the United States. That's for sure. And in my small country, where we are only 5.5 million people, we need within the next 10 years an additional 250,000 new members of our community to help us to maintain our welfare system, our production, and so forth. But people are still reluctant to receive refugees. It's really sad. We have a job to do to teach our small communities. Sorry for talking too much, but I couldn't resist. But thank you again.
Thank you so much, Orla. Peter, your final comment.
Thanks very much. A few points, and I will try and be very quick. First, thank you so much, Saulo, for raising the issue in a very personal context that made it very real for us. I only know the US resettlement system, and I know it from the outside. I was always on the end of working with IOM to bring people who were then resettled by the domestic resettlement agencies. But watching it over the years, a number of things struck me that I'm hearing in your comments. One is, there's limited time and there are limited resources to help these people settle, whether or not they've had trauma, or even just in very simple logistical ways. It seems there's never enough time or resources to help them. I think what this brings us to a point Saulo was making is it's so important to address these issues early on, therefore. And we do focus, as we do in humanitarian emergency situations as well. The first things we always do are the hardware, or the building the camp and getting water there, and we always keep pushing off, sexual violence issues and other issues till further down the road, and we do the same thing here. So I think time is key, which makes me think of one other issue that I always found fascinating to watch from the outside. And it gets to the idea of community. In my mind, what I saw was there's community and community. There was the receiving community in the sense that X number of refugees were being resettled in this town or in this area. But then there was also the community of Bhutanese or of Iraqis or of others who were the very important but not official community receiving these people as well. And I think of after 9/11, particularly when we were trying to resettle a lot of Iraqis into the US, we were being very careful through the 17 agencies to send them all around the country so that, you know, there weren't too many concentrations of these people going there. Well, within 18 months, 90% of them were in Dearborn, Michigan, because that's where all the Arabs were, and that's where they were comfortable. And so, you know, how we come up with, you know, helping these people find the community that's going to help them most, whether it's a truly welcoming, receiving community, or get to the places where there are the natural networks for them, again, to me seems like one more reason why we need to be prepared from the very beginning to deal with these important questions right away, because again, the time and the money is short. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Peter. Jean-Claude.
Yeah, of course, when we start addressing this kind of issues like migration, we open a Pandora box, you know, where with so many issues. When I work on the issue in Europe, you know, my first appreciation was that the response was extremely poor. But I also realized the importance of the do not harm principle, because, we see what we see is a crisis of migration. You know, we see states not capable of delivering according to their commitments to international law. But in the meantime, we see the very same states failing their own citizens. Access to health, access to education, access to social services become extremely sensitive issues. And when I work with migrants in the city of Nantes in France, you know, I have seen how we managed to get free access to hospital services for migrant people. But in the meantime, we saw a growing reaction because local people were getting more and more difficulties to get access to the very same services. And the very same applied with social services, housing, and so on and so forth. I really agree with Saulo about the importance of psychosocial support. Most of the adolescents I have been in contact with during the migration crisis were in need of such kind of support. But in the meantime, in the countries, these services are not available for other adolescents, you know, and it is always a critical element we need to take into account into our responses. The best responses could produce the worst result as such, you know, being the rejection of the migrant people, where our obligation is to contribute to the integration of such people. So I have no answers, but I only have concern because I see that we are working, and I guess this is most probably similar issues in the US, even if access to social services is very different in that country. But we always need to look at the issue in more global perspective and ensure that what we provide for migrants can be accepted as long as we ensure that it is provided to other people in the meantime. You know, if not, we think we do the best and we are doing the worst as such.
Fantastic. Pilar, final comments?
Yes, thank you very much, Saulo. And I agree with Jean-Claude that we should, that was a real problem with salaries for teachers, for refugee teachers, or for national teachers. And that is always an issue that we need to look into. Well, anyway, thank you very much, Saulo. It's been more than overemphasized the importance and or relevance of psychosocial support. I think since been working on this since 1994 with the Rwanda genocide, and it's always it's always something else to do and something more to do. But anyway, we will continue doing that. Okay,
Thank you very much. Okay, and we'll have to be brief because we're almost half an hour past. Jim? Final comments, Jim?
I've said too much already, but wonderful meeting. Thank you.
Thanks. Pete?
Yes, I'll add my voice of thanks to you. Lots of very provocative there. I love the personal testimony. I suppose the real challenge for me constantly is how can we undertake responses at scale, but recognize that the evidence base for what works in what context is so rudimentary in many areas. And it's just that conundrum about building up experience and knowing how we can do it. And Pilar and Jean-Claude, I think you made a great point. And one thing that we've learned very recently, certainly in my association with young people and mental health, is one is putting them at the center of the design process for services very clearly so that they can determine it. And secondly, are we really using the infrastructures of schools and education establishments to create that connectivity, safe spaces, and so that we've got an infrastructure at scale, and education as one of the biggest one, in order to try and also demedicalize some of the responses that we undertake.
Right. Thanks. Those are fantastic points. Martin?
Yeah, no, a fantastic discussion. And maybe I could just propose a draft principle, which is that the more refugees are able to settle within communities with which they are familiar and from which they gain support, the less they are likely to need personalized mental health treatment. And if we had time, I would tell a story that Everett knows very well, which is the program that sent 1,000 mountain people from Laos to French Guyana, who became vegetable farmers, and the program that sent 100,000 of the same people to the United States. And those who went to French Guyana 10 years later showed far lower levels of stress and anxiety than those who went to the United States. So that's my comment.
That's great. Thank you. Elaine?
Well, I would just thank everybody for a wonderful discussion. I learned from Saulo, continue to learn from him, and enjoy working with him. I was just going to build on Martin's. I think that I would say what principles, the more the refugee community and the receiving communities are trauma informed, the more overall well-being for everybody there will be. So there's a lot out there to do, but this was really an encouraging and helpful conversation. So thank you to everybody.
Great, thank you. Sadamini?
Yes, thank you. It's been an amazing session once again. I just wanted to maybe say a point of community base, and that the key is trust. I mean, one of the issues we're dealing with a community that's multiracial, and also the indigenous Native American communities. And the trust has been broken so many times that you can't just walk in there and provide this kind of support, because that's why it has to be within the community where there has an established trust. So that relationship, it's so important. And just one little illustration of that: the kids in the schools here, they don't even go to the school counselors because they don't trust them. So that's a big issue to figure out.
That's great. Thank you. Niels?
Thank you. Not really anything to add to the fantastic comments of everyone, and thank you, Saulo. But there's one area that I would love if we could look into down the line that I think all of us are very bad at. And that is the increasing infiltration of criminality into the refugee flows. Most of homicides at the moment in Sweden take place in the gang fights. Gangs simply find that Sweden is a very suitable place to act from. And we're not very apt at dealing with it. And it's undermining, contributing to undermine refugee reception and so on. In Colombia, very clearly, they received over 1 million from Venezuela. And now it's extremely easy for Maduro to send guys for whom he pays apartments and salaries to create disruption in Colombia and thereby undermine the reception of Venezuelans in Colombia. And I could give many other examples. And this group, all of us, I think, are not very good at how do we tackle that type of thing. So some type of reflection around it down the line would be interesting. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much. Vernon.
Just to echo what a number of others have said, and that is really grateful for the rich comments and observations and questions and the opportunity to listen to Saulo again every time you see something new. So thank you for that.
Thank you very much. Krishna.
The only point I would like to add is that through the project that we are involved in, South Armenia and myself particularly in the US on mental health and psychosocial support, we have developed some tools, and they are about assessing needs, talking to communities in terms of focus groups, rapid surveys with youth and so on, as well as some training modules that are going to be implemented soon. If anyone in our group is interested in learning from them, putting them to use, sharing with others, gradually we'll be glad to provide them as they are finalized, because it has taken months and months of work to pull them together, and they should be used. All the best, Saulo.
Thanks. Thank you very much, Krishna. Lastly, Claudio.
Nothing to add. Sorry I came late.
Great. Well, it's nice to have you with us. Saulo, last comments from you.
I just wish that I had time with each of you and visit you and have coffee, tea, or beer, or whatever you drink, to process all your excellent comments and advice as well. I just think that, yes, I'm interested in preparing communities who are receiving people and people who are at different processes of migration to become trauma aware, informed, to treat the wounded when they arrive as well. That's one of the things that I'm really interested in. If we want healthy immigrant communities, we must do this. We need to prepare the receiving communities as well, and the communities who are migrating at the same time as well, for holistic integration. I think that's great. Thank you so much for the opportunity, for the time. I hope we continue the conversation at some more point. But if you're interested in continuing the conversation directly with me, Everett has the connection. We're connected in different ways, so please connect with me. Thank you so much for the opportunity.
Thank you so much, everyone, and for fantastic. And remember, as you probably saw on the note, that next week we will not have the forum, at least in this part of the world and many other parts. Next week is the Eid celebration, and so at least half of the world will be not working, and then there is the Ascension, which is for other parts will also be on vacation. So we'll come together the week after. Thank you very much, Saulo, and everyone, for a fantastic session.